Whether you're here in person or worshiping with us online, it's good to be together for worship this morning. Our kids are going to be released now for Children's Church. They're going to go out that way in the back. That's for ages 3 years old through second grade. And so they're going to head to the other building and have a time of worship over there. I've been reminded just even in the last day or so of how, last week we sat here, and I think last Sunday we're sort of painfully aware of the ways in which an act of violence that kills one person can have an effect and an impact on a community and the pain and hurt that can bring about. And so today as we sit here, I'm aware and my heart hurts for the community of Buffalo and for the people there, and for an act of violence that killed 10 people there in a shooting yesterday, especially when it seems by all indications it was an act motivated by racism and hatred. And so my heart hurts for those people, that community today, and the reminders of all the things that brings up. So we want to be prayerful, certainly, and mindful of those people and all that were affected there. And so with that in mind too, I think that today's story is fitting in a couple of ways. Today we're going to get to Genesis 4, which is the story of Cain killing his brother. And so part of what we find in this story is a God who listens to the blood of an innocent victim cry out from the grave. We find a God who hears the cries of innocent victims. And we also, I think, though, at the center of this story are met with some questions really about anger. What do we do with our anger? I think that's a question that sort of sits underneath the rest of the story and the narrative that we find here. Are we willing to examine our anger? Are we willing to sit with our anger? There's a well-known quote that's been rephrased in different ways and different times that some of you have probably heard that goes something like this: I sat with my anger long enough until it told me its name was grief. Are we willing to sit with our anger? I think in some ways what we're going to find today is a story of a man who was unwilling to sit with his anger. We might have some questions as we read this story about, so why was Cain angry? We're going to get to that a little bit later about some possibilities about that. But part of me thinks that Cain was just unwilling to ask those questions of himself, unwilling to just sit and say, why am I angry? And then in turn, what am I going to do with my anger? What am I going to let my anger do within me or cause me to do? I think those are some questions that kind of sit at the center of our story this morning. So we're going to read Genesis 4, and actually, in just a second, Isley, if you want to go ahead and come up here, Isley is going to read Genesis 4 for us because for some reason, in a question that makes me, in a realization of something that makes me question a lot about myself as a parent, Isley's favorite story is a story about an older sibling killing
The Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who better than what you did."
That's good.
That's not a reason to kill somebody.
That's not a reason to kill somebody. Very good. All right, our prayer of confession, and she's much more concise. She's going to make a good preacher. A lot of y'all would probably prefer her. So thank you, Isley. Go have a seat. Here, can you take that to Kevin? Yeah, that's just because someone did something better than you is not a reason to kill someone. So if you take nothing else from today, you can take that, and that's good. But this story is another one that's just full of all kinds of fascinating little details and questions for us to potentially consider. And I've talked about that in previous weeks, that these first few chapters of Genesis just invite a lot of questions, and that trend certainly continues in this story today. For instance, this story seems to assume, or Cain seems to assume in this story, that as he leaves, he's going to encounter more people. Which already we're met with some questions. So what does that mean? How did these other people get there? If Adam and Eve are sort of the first, genuinely the first two humans, how do we already have a fully populated earth outside of their family? Cain also assumes, with some amount of certainty, that as he goes out into this new world that he's going to encounter, that the people that he meets there will kill him. Which means that Cain either just assumes that everyone has an evil streak in them like he does, or he is aware of the fact that sin and evil just exist amongst people, and that is just kind of a given. And so already we're met with questions like, so were Adam and Eve actually the first two people? And if so, what do we make of all these other people? How did they get there? Could it be that Adam and Eve are perhaps just some type of archetypes of the human story and of human frailty? Could they be a representation of Israel on a nuclear family level, a people that are set apart and called for an expressed purpose, who then abdicate that calling and that purpose when they fail to follow God's commands and turn away from Him and are then driven from their land? Could it be all of those things together somehow, or none of those things and something that we completely miss? Sure, any of those things. But I think one of the things that we find in Genesis is that the author or authors of Genesis don't really seem to be that interested in clarifying some of these questions. And so there are theories that we can talk about. There are lots of ideas that we can throw around, and those are interesting and fun to do for some of us. Some people are like, I could care less. But for some of us, it's interesting. But we're not really told where these other people come from. It's just something that is presented to us as just kind of fact. There's some other people out there, and Cain's worried about them. No details about where they came from, how they got there, if everybody was created at one time, and Adam and Eve are kind of this separate story that's just told kind of as some of the first people. It's not really laid out. And so again, though, I think that when we start asking questions of the text and are willing to sort of dig into it, while some of it we're never going to really be able to know, and that's okay, it does help us, I think, to see some of the richness and the depth of the story here as we look at these stories of the beginnings of humanity, some of the nature of sin and evil, and what we're told about those things from the very beginning. And so speaking of sin, I want to also say a couple of things about sin before we get to some specifics of this story. We're going to go back through kind of some specifics of that Cain and Abel story in just a little bit. But before we get there, just some kind of over some broad thoughts about sin. I think it's interesting that Adam and Eve are not really prominently mentioned from this point forward in the Old Testament, really at all. After Genesis 5, Adam is only mentioned probably once in the rest of the Old Testament. He comes up once in a genealogy in 1 Chronicles, There's another place in Hosea where some people think he's mentioned, but it seems like that reference is more to a place that was called Adam, not a person, Adam. So even if you take that, once or twice, Adam comes up in the rest of the Old Testament. Eve is not mentioned by name after Genesis 4. Never mentioned again by name. In fact, Eve is directly mentioned by name as many times in Paul's writings as she is in the whole Old Testament, just twice. Her given name, Eve, comes up twice in the Old Testament and twice in Paul's writings. They're just not that prominently featured in the Old Testament, which sort of seems odd. Like if you read the first few chapters, you would expect these people to come up a lot over the course of the rest of the narrative, especially if Israel, in their way of thinking, linked all of human sin and separation from God and difficulties in working the earth, if they saw all those things as being linked back to Adam and Eve, I think we would expect them to come up after that point. But they really just sort of disappear from the narrative. They're not mentioned really at all. And so what does that have to do with sin then? Well, I think mostly, thanks to the writings of Paul, we tend to build a lot of our theology about sin around Adam and Eve and what we call their original sin. But Paul builds his theology of sin and redemption around the sin of Adam and Eve in a way that is really completely foreign to the writers of the Old Testament. When we hear about and read about sin in the Old Testament, it is much more about personal and communal failure of people to make good choices and follow God's laws. The reality of that is embodied and on display in the story of Adam and Eve and in the story of Cain. But the rest of the writings in the Old Testament do not speak of people inheriting their sinful nature from Adam and Eve. People, individuals, and the collective people of a certain time are always fully capable of both good and evil. There is not this expectation that God has of people that says, well, after the fall, you're just going to be evil. No, even in this story that we read today, you may have noticed in God's words to Cain, he says, look, you've got the chance to do good here. Like if you do what is right, you will be accepted, is the way that it says there. In other words, God has this expectation of Cain that you are fully capable of making good choices and responding to the situation well. Now, he doesn't, and that's the human story over and over again. But in the Old Testament, the story repeatedly is, you have a chance to do this well, and repeatedly people don't. And so there are consequences to those things, but the other thing that we see repeatedly is that even in repeated failure, God does not fully ever abandon his people. Even when he sends Cain away from his presence in this story because of Cain's sin, it's interesting that because of Cain's fear that, hey, someone's going to kill me, ironically, just like I killed my brother. It's like, you could have thought about that with Abel. Like, that would have been a nice thing to think about. But anyways, he says, someone's going to kill me. So God gives him a mark. And again, a lot of questions. What was the mark of Cain? Plenty of theories. Whatever it was, God gives him a mark that is in some ways a reminder of his sin, but is in other ways this act of grace and protection, another covering, if you will, kind of like we talked about last week with Adam and Eve. It is a covering, it is a sign of God's protection over Cain as he goes about wandering the earth. And so even as Cain is sent away from God's presence, he is not sent away without God's protection and grace and mercy. That even for the murderer, there is protection, there is grace, there is mercy. And so, I think, though, one of the things we find is that in the Old Testament, sin is always the fault of people in their own time and place, failing to remember and follow God. And Paul, viewing the entirety of the story then through the lens of Jesus, and focusing then on the nature of forgiveness, grace, and reconciliation, connects all of these threads now, going back all the way to the stories of Adam and Eve. But it's important, I think, to note that Paul is drawing some conclusions there that are really not brought out in any part of the law or Old Testament. none of the way that Paul then kind of envisions sin and redemption and forgiveness is really referenced at all in the law or the Old Testament. Of course, that's obviously on the other side of Jesus. And I say that not to challenge what Paul wrote, but just to say that I think it's another example of Paul creatively and contextually looking back on his heritage and his story with a fresh perspective in light of the story of Jesus. That now Paul is going back and re-examining everything in light of the story of the gospel in his day and time. And so I say that to draw focus then also to what I think the text seems to be doing here, pointing to as it relates to sin. Instead of being just an origin story about how we as a whole of humanity have come to have a sinful nature, it seems to be focused on what leads to sin within an individual. How do we respond to our sin? How can we keep ourselves from sin? And then how does God engage with us in light of that? How does God respond to those things? So, with that, we're going to look at some specifics of this story now. So if you still have your Bible open or your phone and you want to follow along in Genesis 4, I'm just going to walk through a few things in this story that I think we find, that I think are interesting, and that I think speak to some of this idea of sin. What do we do with sin, and what do we do with our anger? So for instance, as I said at the beginning, we might have some questions here about, so why is Cain angry, and why does God look on Cain's offering, his gift, his sacrifice, why does God look on his offering with less favor than he does so Abel? And so there's a couple of different theories or ideas about that. It seems to be that part of what we find there is that Abel brings sort of the best of the best, and Cain just brings something. And we find that in part because Abel's offering, it says he brings the fat portions of some of the firstborn of his flock. And so the fat portions of an animal would have been thought to be the best, the choicest portions of an animal. The firstborn of a flock was the best of the flock. And so Abel is literally bringing the best of the best to God as an offering. Cain, it just says he brought some produce. He brought some fruit. It doesn't say that he brought like the bad stuff. It doesn't say Cain brought the misshapen potatoes or whatever it was, right? Like it doesn't go that far, but it also doesn't say he brought the best of the best. But it also doesn't say here that Cain's offering or that Abel's offering was better. It never expressly says that. In fact, it's not, again, until the New Testament that we have that. In Hebrews, the Hebrews writer tells us that Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. So that was at least part of the Israelites' tradition, a part of the Jewish tradition, was that Abel brought a better sacrifice, and because of that, Cain was angry. But I think what we also find throughout Scripture sometimes is that sometimes God looks in favor on one person's offering over another's, and we don't really have the reasons for it. Sometimes that may be because God is looking out kind of for the underdog or for the oppressed. One of the things that's interesting about this story to me, if you just look at the beginning, it says that Eve gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." And so the name Cain, the word, means something like brought forth or created. There's sort of this idea of creation and pride in what you have brought forth through God with Cain. It even gives us like the reasoning for why he was named Cain. With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. And then it just says, later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Like that's it. No explanation. Abel's name means breath or vapor. And it has the connotation of something that quickly disappears or is worthless. So you have this idea from their birth. Again, the names come up a lot in the Old Testament as having meaning, right? From their birth, Cain's name means I have created and acquired something with the help of God. Abel's name means it's just like a disappearing vapor. Well, that's not very good from the start. What if Abel was like the forgotten little brother? If any of you are a younger sibling and you think your older sibling had it better, imagine being, at least in the way that we're told the story in Genesis, the firstborn of all firstborns. Like maybe Cain is just like the super entitled brother or something like that. Whatever it is, there's also kind of this theory, this thought that perhaps for reasons that we don't know, God simply looks on Abel's offering with more favor than he does Cain. Paul speaks of this in his writings in Romans, where he quotes Moses, and he says, God says, I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion and mercy on whom I have mercy. And we kind of struggle with that concept, but realistically in life, we know that sometimes good things happen to people that if we look at it, we just think they don't deserve that. At the same time, bad things happen to faithful people, and we notice some people's lives, and we're just like, man, these people are amazing, loving, generous, faithful, gracious people, and they just can't catch a break. Like, what do we do with that? Sometimes things like that just happen, and we can't make sense of it. And so either of those things might lead us to a place of anger. Perhaps Cain's anger is really sort of self-loathing, that he didn't bring what he knew he should have brought. And so if he would sit with his anger long enough, he would realize, maybe my anger is really calling me to examine what I need to be doing with my life. Maybe I'm getting defensive because I know there are things I need to be doing differently. I'm guessing we've all been like Cain at some point and sort of offered a gift that really didn't cost us much, if that's what's happening here. You know, I sort of think if that's kind of the view you have of the story, I sort of think of Cain maybe as like the person giving away clothing that he doesn't wear anymore, or that's old, or that doesn't fit, or that's out of style. And so it can be an act of good, it can be a good gesture to give that away to someone else in need, but it doesn't really cost me much. It doesn't really require that much sacrifice on my part. Whereas Abel is kind of offering his favorite shirt to God. And so perhaps Cain's anger is examining, where do I need to be more selfless and sacrificial? Or perhaps it's Cain just looking at life and saying, man, sometimes life isn't fair, and that makes me angry. It isn't fair that some people lose their lives in acts of senseless violence. So what do we do with that? What do we do with the anger that comes from that? How do we sit with that? And so then God comes into the picture. God's asking this question, why are you angry? Maybe he too just wants Cain to sit with this for a little bit. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? That's another question there, or that's another question that we could sort of hear in a couple of ways. One, you could hear it as referencing kind of Cain's sacrifice. You could hear it as God saying, look, if you'll just offer a better sacrifice, you'll be accepted and viewed in favor too. But I think there's maybe something else that God is asking there. I think this is still in reference to his anger, and that God is saying, you have a choice here in what you're going to do with your anger. What are you going to do? How are you going to respond to your anger? What is that going to produce within you? He goes on, but if you do not do what is right, in other words, I sort of hear that is, if you do not do what is right with your anger, if you do not process this well, if you do not deal with this in a way that is healthy and productive, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So God here envisions sin as this like ravenous animal that is waiting at Cain's door, ready to devour him and consume him. And interestingly, God then says, you must rule over it. And this is really the original charge given to humans back in Genesis 1, ironically, to rule over animals, to rule over the other created beings in creation. And now, God kind of applies that same language to this ravenous animal at Cain's door and says, this is the animal that you now have to rule over. You have to rule over your sin, your anger. You are fully capable of doing it, but it's going to take work and effort. What are you going to do with your anger? If you don't deal with it well, it's going to devour you and consume you, and you're going to make mistakes. So we know from the story then that Cain does in fact allow it to devour and consume him, which leads to him killing his brother. And what follows there is interesting, I think, in contrast to what happened earlier in Genesis as well. After he kills Abel, God comes in and he says, "Where's your brother Abel?" Which is similar to the question that God asked of Adam back in Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, God comes into the garden and says, "Where are you?" So these are very similar questions. Now, once God finds Adam, Adam just kind of fesses up to stuff. In Adam's defense, he says, "I heard you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." But when God asked this of Abel, "Where's your brother?" when God asked this of Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" Cain says, "I don't know." And then we have this famous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" He's still pretty defiant, defensive, probably still angry. And so God goes along to give him this curse, talks about he will live under a curse, tells him he will be a restless wanderer on the earth. And then Cain in response says, "My punishment is more than I can bear. You are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence." So again, we have this contrast between him and his parents. Adam and Eve, in their fear, hide themselves. Cain, in his anger, is still sort of defensive and says, "You're hiding me from your presence. I'm going to be hidden from your presence." Still sort of pointing all this back at God. That's when he says, "Then I'll be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So as I referenced earlier, God then puts a mark on Cain so that he will be protected even as he is sent away from God's presence. And then verse 16 says, "So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden." Some of that language is where we're going to pick up next week too. But this idea of moving east of Eden is sort of synonymous with moving away from God's presence. As people move east of Eden, as people move away from Eden, literally and figuratively, they move further away from God, from his will, from the ways that God is calling them to live. And this has all kinds of ramifications as they go forward. And as Cain moves east of Eden, he ends up in the land of Nod, which Nod means wandering. But as he and God both had previously stated, they said, "You're going to be a restless wanderer." But instead of wandering in the land of wandering, Cain settles there. He lives there. And as we're going to see next week, he even builds a city there. And so in this act of building a city, which again we're going to look at next week, one of the things we find is that people are doing a very good job of one thing that God originally told them to do. God originally told them to be fruitful and fill the earth. And they are filling the earth. They're just not filling it with what God originally had in mind. So by the time you get to Genesis 6 then, before the flood, it says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence." So in Genesis 1, we have God telling people, "Fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And by Genesis 6, it says the earth was corrupt and full of violence. And so I think there's a question then that this invites us to think about. And that is, what are our actions filling the world with? We fill the world with something in the ways that we go about living our lives. We have a choice in what it is that we fill the earth with. What are we filling the earth with? What types of cities are we creating, as we're going to see next week? And are we willing and able to sit with our anger, to sit with the things that don't make sense to us, to sit with the things that we know need to change in our lives, so that we can fill the earth with the types of things that God is calling us to fill it with, so that we can fill the earth with grace and love and mercy and compassion and forgiveness, instead of continuing to fill the earth with more corruption and violence and hatred and destruction.